I'm Dr. Rick Wilson from Rice University, and this is Polytricks.
It's commonplace to hear people say that they don't know who to trust or what to trust when it comes to information about the coronavirus pandemic. In the United States, this uncertainty has been compounded by a bitter partisan election. While it would be nice to tell people whom they should trust, in other words, scientists and professionals, it would be helpful to know who is trusting whom and why. That's what I hope to highlight in this short talk. In order to understand how trust has played out in the time of COVID-19, it's essential to have been following the same people before and during the pandemic. Fortunately, Rice's class of 2020 have been my guinea pigs since before they arrived on campus in 2016. I've been routinely testing them throughout their career at Rice, and I continue to follow them since they've graduated. Sadly, their last semester, their graduation, and the beginning of their careers have all been accompanied by COVID. Nonetheless, they've continued to respond to my many studies. I asked them to participate in March, again in late April, and again in July. Are these Rice students trusting? I employed a standard question used in surveys. Quote, would you say that most people can be trusted or that you can't be too careful in dealing with people? End quote. Before students arrived at Rice, they were cautious, but by April of 2020, they were far more trusting when answering this question. Well, this shows that Rice students are trusting, but probably of one another. In April 2020 and again in July, I asked students about specific targets of trust. These were generic questions about trusting leaders, political institutions, and news sources. Not surprising, given the liberal bent of Rice students, the president and Fox News were not trusted, nor were governors of various states in which the students were living. The CDC, state health officials, local hospitals, local public officials, and local police were trusted in April, following the first wave of COVID. The same was true for local news sources. Fortunately, these Rice respondents also thought that the university could be trusted. A great deal happened between April and late July of 2020. On this figure, I plot changing levels of trust. Red arrows to the left mean decreasing trust, and blue arrows to the right indicate increasing trust. Although students overwhelmingly distrusted the president in April, that distrust grew during the second wave of COVID. There's little change for the CDC. For state governors, state health, and local public officials, trust declines. There is a substantial decline in trust for the police, not surprising given the events surrounding George Floyd and others over the course of the summer. Local hospitals remain a source of trust. What does this mean for behavior? Many of the current findings by political scientists point to partisanship. If you're wearing a mask, you must be a Democrat. Although Rice students overwhelmingly identify themselves as Democrats, over 15% identify as Republicans. Do these two groups behave differently? I asked respondents about a dozen actions they'd taken to avoid contracting COVID-19, including social distancing, washing one's hands, wearing a face mask in public, etc. These items were summed to create a single scale ranging from 0 to 100%, with the latter implying taking all possible precautions. Sure enough, Republicans are likely to engage in about 65% of preventative actions, while Democrats do so for about 75% of the items. This is a difference amounting to a little over one distinct action. But it's not blind partisanship that's necessarily driving the differences. My point here relates to whom you trust. If I split students into two groups, those who distrust and those who trust a specific political institution, it becomes very clear who's being listened to. For example, trusting the president, which is true for 11% of the sample, is linked to a 28% decrease in mitigation behaviors. Likewise, trusting in Fox News creates an 18% gap in mitigation. This is equivalent to taking 2 fewer precautions. Trusting in the governor or local police leads to a gap that's about the same as identifying as a partisan. The only place where we see a reverse are for those who trust in local hospitals. Knowing what kinds of precautionary behavior to take for COVID-19 is not at all clear. There's been a wealth of information, disinformation, and contradiction. While it may seem that people are only using a simple heuristic, that is partisanship, to decide what to do, as usual the story is more nuanced. Who, or what you trust, is critically important. Politicians, news outlets, pundits all filter information through a partisan lens. Trusting what they have to say has important consequences for your health in this pandemic. Beware of whom you trust.